August 6, 1942. The jungle around the Guadalcanal airstrip was heavy with fog and the hum of insects. The war in the Pacific was still young, and the Americans who held that patch of steaming earth were barely more than boys, nervous, sleepless, and strung tight as wire. At one of the makeshift checkpoints, a group of soldiers waited, rifles aimed into the darkness. They had heard whispers all day about Japanese scouts disguised as Allied troops, men who could mimic English, who could even imitate the lazy southern drawl of the Marines. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a warning. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Figures emerged, carrying what looked like American gear. Their posture was disciplined, their English flawless. "Friendlies," one of them said softly. "We're from the 2nd Battalion." The Marine corporal in charge didn't answer immediately. His hand tightened on the trigger of his Thompson. He'd been told not to trust anyone without a password. The new rule had just come down that morning. A test word. Something strange. Something no foreigner could say right. He stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight trembling over their faces. "Say the word," he demanded. "Say, Lollapalooza." The men froze. One of them blinked, then tried. "Lollapalooza," he stammered. Another followed, mangling it worse. The corporal's voice turned cold. "Again." Silence, then a nervous swallow. That was all it took. The sound of rifles split the night. When the echoes died, so did the illusion. They weren't Americans after all. It sounded like a scene out of fiction, but incidents like this were alarmingly real. During the Pacific campaigns of World War II, Japanese infiltrators often tried to slip into Allied camps disguised as U.S. troops, Filipino guerrillas, or local laborers. They carried forged papers, copied slang, even memorized names of American officers. The stakes were deadly. A single successful infiltrator could sabotage an airfield, blow up fuel depots, or signal naval artillery onto Allied positions. Commanders began to realize that camouflage wasn't just about uniforms anymore. It was about language. The problem was simple but dangerous. Many Japanese soldiers had studied English in school, and some officers spoke it well enough to pass in dim light and confusion. They could greet guards, give correct answers to casual questions, even imitate the easy confidence of American speech. That's when the U.S. command in the Pacific started using what they called linguistic tripwires, passwords intentionally chosen to be phonetically difficult for Japanese speakers. Words like cornstalk, rhubarb, and most famously Lollapalooza. Lollapalooza wasn't a military term at all. It was old carnival slang, meaning something extraordinary or out of the ordinary. It came from fairs and circuses, and many soldiers had never even heard of it before. But it was the perfect test. Japanese lacked the L and R contrast in their phonetic system, and the cluster of sounds in Lollapalooza, with its loose American rhythm, was almost impossible to say naturally for non-native speakers. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. As one soldier later joked, you could teach a man to salute like an American, but you couldn't teach him to say Lollapalooza without tripping over his tongue. The word spread quickly through the Pacific theater, on Guadalcanal, on New Guinea. Even on small atolls that barely showed on maps, young Marines whispered it like a charm before patrol. A private from Iowa, named Tom Healy, wrote home in September 1942. "They make us say this funny word at night, Lollapalooza. It's like a spell. If a guy says it right, he's one of ours. If not, well, he ain't going home." His letter, later archived at the National World War II Museum, captures the eerie blend of fear and absurdity that hung over those nights. The fear was justified. In the first months of the Guadalcanal campaign alone, American units recorded over 20 infiltration attempts. Japanese scouts dressed in stolen khaki uniforms, carrying captured Springfield rifles, tried to enter supply depots or command posts. Some even managed to blend in for hours before being discovered. When the Marines caught on, they started relying less on faces and more on voices. It was a human equivalent of a password-protected gate. One evening in late August, a Marine sergeant named Raymond Bishop stopped 3 men at a checkpoint near Henderson Field. They carried the right papers, the right insignia, even the right nervous swagger. But when Bishop asked for the password, one of them hesitated. "Say again," Bishop barked. "Lollapalooza." The man's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His hand twitched toward his belt, and before he could draw, Bishop's men opened fire. Later, searching their bodies, they found Japanese paybooks hidden under their shirts. Bishop's report ended with a grim note. It wasn't their guns that gave them away. It was their tongues. The strategy worked, and soon the word Lollapalooza became a small legend among Allied troops. It was strange, funny, and deadly serious all at once. Soldiers began competing to come up with harder passwords: squirrel, thoroughbred, Kentucky, and even popcorn. Each word had to be something a native speaker could say without hesitation. One officer recalled laughing when he first saw the list. "I thought the brass had lost their minds," he said. But after the third infiltration attempt that week, it didn't seem so funny anymore. Behind the humor was a grim calculation. Every failed pronunciation meant a life saved. Every word that tripped an infiltrator's tongue could prevent a grenade from landing in a mess tent. Linguists later analyzed this strange wartime phenomenon, noting how phonetics became a form of battlefield intelligence. It wasn't just about accents. It was about the microscopic timing of speech, the split-second pauses that betrayed a foreign rhythm. Night after night, the checkpoints became stages for these tense linguistic duels. Soldiers listened harder than they ever had in their lives. The jungle was alive with crickets, the buzz of mosquitoes, and the occasional rumble of distant artillery. The smell of gun oil and damp canvas hung in the air. The guards were exhausted, their eyes red, but they couldn't afford to relax. Every voice from the dark was a potential trap, and yet, amid all that tension, humor found a way in. If the Japs ever learned to say their L's, one Marine joked, "We're done for." That humor was survival. It kept men sane in a war that often made no sense. The absurdity of a word like Lollapalooza, being the line between life and death, became a strange comfort. Proof that even in chaos, there was some small, bizarre order. By mid-September, the password test was standard practice in most Pacific outposts. The Army even issued quiet guidelines for choosing daily passwords. Avoid common words. Pick something odd, untranslatable, preferably American in spirit. Baseball terms work well, so did small-town slang. One night the password was Chicago, the next rhubarb. The soldiers didn't know it, but they were participating in a kind of cultural warfare, using language itself as a weapon. For all its success, the system was not foolproof. A few infiltrators had trained specifically in pronunciation drills. Some managed to pass the test, slipping through before being caught by other means. Still, most failed. The phonetic wall between languages was too strong, too ingrained to overcome in the heat of the moment. Even fluent speakers betrayed themselves under pressure. The human mouth, after all, has its own memories. In later years, military historians would look back at this practice as both ingenious and tragic. Ingenious, because it turned a simple word into a defensive mechanism. Tragic, because it reminded everyone how fragile identity became in war. The difference between friend and enemy wasn't ideology or uniform. It was the shape of a vowel, the flicker of hesitation before a syllable. Private Healy, the young soldier from Iowa, survived the war. Decades later, at a veterans reunion, he reportedly laughed when asked about the strangest thing he remembered. "That word," he said, "Lollapalooza, I still don't know what it means. But I'll never forget how it sounded in the dark." There was irony there, that a nonsense word born from American showmanship and fairgrounds had once stood as the last line of defense on a battlefield. It was pure Americana meeting the harshest realities of global war. And it worked, not because of magic, but because language, that fragile thread of culture and identity, could not be faked under fear. As the months went on, the Japanese learned of the password system. They began trying to anticipate the words, to practice pronunciation drills, even to use captured interpreters to coach their infiltrators. But the Americans kept changing the words, kept inventing stranger ones. It was an ever-shifting game, and one that showed just how human the war really was, a clash not just of armies and machines, but of tongues, sounds, and meanings. By autumn, the stories of Lollapalooza spread across the Pacific like campfire folklore. Some swore it saved their entire platoon. Others claimed it was just a myth, but in the record books of the Guadalcanal campaign, there are dozens of confirmed incidents where passwords exposed disguised enemies. Those stories were whispered long after the battles ended, not as tales of triumph, but as quiet reminders of how close fear and absurdity lived side by side in war. For the young soldiers manning those checkpoints, the word wasn't just a password. It was a prayer, a small piece of home, wrapped in laughter and fear, standing guard in the middle of a foreign jungle. And though the guns have long gone silent, the echo of that word still lingers, half comic, half sacred. Lollapalooza. But what those men didn't yet know was that the enemy was listening to and learning. The word that had once drawn the line between life and death would soon become the start of an entirely new kind of warfare. A battle fought not with bullets, but with language itself. November 1942. The rain came down in silver sheets over the Solomon Islands, flattening the jungle into a dripping mass of green and gray. The war had turned, but only slightly, and the Americans who held those muddy foxholes had learned not to celebrate too soon. The Lollapalooza test, the word that once felt like a magic charm, was now standard practice at every checkpoint. For months, it had worked perfectly. No infiltrator had made it through without slipping up on some impossible syllable. But the enemy, clever and disciplined, had been paying attention. They had learned to listen as well as to fight. One cold, wet night, a small patrol approached a Marine outpost outside Henderson Field. The guards, soaked and shivering, raised their rifles. "Password," one barked. The lead soldier, or what looked like one, didn't hesitate. "Lollapalooza," he said clearly, even with a casual smirk. The guard frowned. It was perfect, too perfect. "Spell it," he said suddenly. That's when the mask cracked. The infiltrator hesitated, searching for letters he didn't know. The pause lasted less than a second, but that was all it took. The word that had once been a test of sound became a test of meaning. Bullets followed. The Lollapalooza system had just evolved, and with it, so had the war of words. The story that night spread like wildfire. American soldiers began to realize that passwords weren't enough. They needed follow-ups, small linguistic traps. One unit asked for the definition of the word. Another demanded soldiers say it while chewing tobacco or under a cough, knowing that only natives could maintain the rhythm. The absurdity of it all didn't escape anyone. We were fighting a war with dictionaries, one Marine later laughed. Yet beneath the laughter was a grim truth. The front line had become linguistic. It wasn't just about passwords anymore. Language itself, accent, inflection, timing became a weapon. Allied linguists stationed in the Pacific began training soldiers in phonetic awareness, teaching them to spot hesitation or misplaced stress. They learned that Japanese speakers, even fluent ones, tended to clip certain consonants or soften final vowels unconsciously. Soldiers began using these cues as warning signs. It was crude but effective. One intelligence officer later explained it this way. You can fake a salute, you can forge an ID, but you can't fake the muscle memory of your mother tongue. That simple idea saved countless lives. By late 1943, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, known as ATIS, was collecting reports of hundreds of thwarted infiltration attempts thanks to linguistic passwords and speech recognition tests. Colonel Sidney Mashburr, who headed the section, recorded in his memoir, "Our men learned to hear danger before they saw it. The difference between a friend and an enemy could be found in a single syllable." Still, the Japanese were not far behind. Captured documents later revealed that their officers had organized renunciation drills, trying to master the tricky English sounds. They practiced tongue twisters, baseball slang, even Hollywood catchphrases. It was surreal. War reduced to phonetic combat lessons. Some camps used American prisoners to teach pronunciation. There's a grimly humorous account of one captured sergeant who was forced to repeat rural juror and thoroughbred to his guards for days on end until he nearly lost his voice. "If I'd known the war would turn into an English class," he wrote later, "I'd have packed a dictionary instead of a rifle." But imitation could only go so far. The Japanese commandos might get the sounds right, but they couldn't always get the feeling right, the unconscious rhythm, the slang, the relaxed tone of a native speaker. American soldiers noticed that infiltrators spoke English like it was an exam. Precise, careful, slightly too formal. Real soldiers, on the other hand, swore constantly, laughed mid-sentence, and dropped their endings. It was chaos, but it was authentic. One Marine guard famously said, "If a guy says a word right but doesn't curse before or after it, shoot first." By 1943, Lollapalooza had become a symbol, a kind of legend passed around from island to island. Even when it wasn't the actual password anymore, men still used it as a joke, a memory of those early nights of fear. They'd say it before heading out on patrol, half mocking, half reverent. In the midst of horror, the word had become oddly comforting. It was American absurdity surviving in a place where nothing else familiar remained. The war of words spread beyond Pacific. On European fronts, similar tests appeared, words like squirrel, bazooka, and Worcestershire. The British used their own version, often involving place names Germans couldn't pronounce. Each side was adapting to the idea that language was not just communication but identity itself. It was the one disguise impossible to perfect. Back in the Pacific, linguists started experimenting with even more subtle speech cues. Things like pacing emotional tone or spontaneous slang responses. A soldier might ask, "Who's winning the World Series?" just to see if the other man knew what baseball was. Sometimes the questions were absurd. "What's your mother's pie made of?" Not for the answer, but for the reaction. The real test wasn't knowledge. It was comfort. Only someone truly American could answer without thinking. Among all these tests, the Lollapalooza story remained the most famous. It appeared in war briefings, radio chatter, even newsreels. There was something irresistibly symbolic about it. A circus word standing between life and death, between civilization and chaos. Soldiers took pride in it, as if it captured what made them American: humor, improvisation, and the ability to turn nonsense into strategy. Yet as the war dragged on, the irony deepened. For many veterans, the word came to represent more than survival. It symbolized the loss of innocence. What had started as a joke turned into a reminder of how thin the line between laughter and fear could be. Private Tom Healy, who had once written home about the password, later said in an interview, "It was funny at first, but then you think, if a man can die just because he can't say one word right, what kind of world is that?" That sentiment haunted many who served. They realized that language meant to unite people had become a tool for division, a way of deciding who lived and who didn't. It was efficient, yes, but also profoundly human in its cruelty. There were even recorded cases where frightened locals were mistaken for infiltrators because of their accents. The same word that saved some lives took others unjustly. History, as always, refused to be simple. One surviving Japanese soldier, interviewed decades later for a documentary, spoke quietly about the experience. "We tried," he said. "We practiced their words, their songs, their laughter. But our mouths, they would not make the same sound. It was like trying to sing with a closed throat." His words were calm, but the sadness beneath them was unmistakable. The barrier wasn't just linguistic. It was cultural, spiritual, the sound of difference made permanent by war. The Americans, too, felt the weight of it. In later years, some linguists who served on Pacific fronts reflected on how language tests blurred the line between intelligence and prejudice. What began as a practical tactic carried an uncomfortable truth. That identity, when reduced to sound, could become deadly. Colonel Mashburn himself wrote after the war, "Language saved lives, but also reminded us of what war strips away: trust, nuance, the humanity of the voice." By the time peace was declared in 1945, the Lollapalooza password had long fallen out of use, replaced by coded radio phrases and cryptographic systems. But the legend endured. Veterans mentioned it in memoirs, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a distant look. It became one of those small, almost unbelievable details that defined the human side of the war, the way absurdity coexisted with terror. At reunions years later, graying men in old uniforms would test each other playfully. "Say it again," they'd grin. "Lollapalooza." They'd all laugh, and for a moment, the word returned to what it once was, a carnival term, harmless, joyful, ridiculous. Yet behind every chuckle was a memory of checkpoints, of nervous voices in the dark, of the knowledge that a syllable could mean salvation or death. One veteran, interviewed in 1982, summed it up best. "We trusted a word more than we trusted a man's face." That's how bad it got. But that's also how smart we had to be. The deeper meaning of the story lies not in the word itself, but in what it represents. In the chaos of global war, when identities blurred and trust was fragile, language became the last uniform a soldier wore. It was invisible, instinctive, and, in the end, unforgeable. The Americans discovered, perhaps without realizing it, that culture could be a weapon, not through superiority, but through familiarity. A word like Lollapalooza was so strange, so rooted in a particular rhythm of speech and humor, that it became unmistakably American, and that, more than any uniform patch, became the line between friend and foe. When the war finally ended and silence fell over the islands, the jungle reclaimed the outposts, the checkpoints, the mud-soaked trails. But the stories endured. A generation later, tourists walking through the remnant of Henderson Field might hear an old veteran chuckle under his breath, muttering that same strange word, half nostalgia, half disbelief. Lollapalooza, a word from carnivals and fairs, dragged halfway across the world to guard a camp of scared boys. In the end, it was never just about pronunciation. It was about what language carried: memory, upbringing, identity. The Americans could have chosen any word, but by picking one that only they could say with ease, they weren't just testing speech. They were reaffirming who they were. Amid the mud and terror war, it was a reminder of home, of laughter, of something deeply human. The closing image belongs to that old veteran again. Sitting in his chair at a reunion, surrounded by the ghosts of his youth, he looks at the camera, smiles faintly, and says, "We used to think we were guarding the base. Turns out we were guarding our own words." The orchestra swells softly, and the screen fades to black. Text appears in quiet white letters. Asterisk during World War II, Allied troops across the Pacific used linguistic passwords like Lollapalooza to detect enemy infiltrators. A word born in American carnivals became, for a brief moment, a line of defense in the darkest hours of war. Asterisk, and in that fading silence, the absurd and the tragic meet, a single word, spoken in the dark, carrying all the weight of trust, fear, and identity.